Hey guys, it's Audra. Welcome to another video. Why am I bringing this up? Because everyone is scared of gluten and wheat products and bread, and like everybody wants to be gluten-free. I know a lot of you are probably, I know I have gluten intolerance, I know I have this, and I'm not saying you don't, okay? People are avoiding gluten for various different reasons. They think they're scared to start reading these low-carb books like Wheat Belly or the Gluten Connection or whatever, the paleo diet, and literally people are scared to death of gluten. Funny thing is, a survey was done and over 30% of Americans expressed the fact that they're going to start, or they have already started, taking out gluten from their diet. The funny thing is, this actual legit celiac disease only affects 1% of the American population. So in America, there's about 320 million Americans. So that means that only around 3.2 million Americans have legit celiac. This is basically the same amount of people in America that have epilepsy. So we know how uncommon epilepsy is. It is a very serious thing, obviously, but it's very uncommon. Not everyone you meet has epilepsy. It's the same thing for celiac. Not everybody you meet has legit diagnosed celiac. So it's basically the same thing too. If the whole population of Iowa, they have about 3 million people who live in Iowa. If the whole population of Iowa had celiac, then only the people in Iowa could have celiac. No one else in the whole United States could have it. You would have to live in Iowa to have celiac. That's how uncommon it is to have legit celiac. There is a trend of people adopting a gluten-free diet for whatever reason. They basically think that it's going to make them lose weight, it's going to make them healthier, it's going to keep them from certain diseases, whatever. Which inevitably they're going to end up feeling worse in the long run, because what they're basically doing is just getting on a low-carb diet at the end of the day. They're cutting out bread, they're cutting out anything that they would normally be eating that's like a baked good or something like that, and they're switching it for vegetables and fruit. So, or not even that, some of them are going super low carb if they're on paleo or something, and they're not eating any carbs at all, and they're going to feel awful. A huge thing about this is when you cut out whole grains, specifically wheat, rye, barley, whatever, you can miss out on fiber, vitamins, nutrients, and that's really tough to get on a gluten-free diet if you're not careful and you don't know what you're doing. And a lot of people will make this excuse and say, modern wheat is not wheat at all, it's totally messed up, blah, 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 the farming is different, everything. Well, the reality is modern food is not real food at all. Unless you have your own garden and your own little apple tree in the backyard, the apples that you're buying from Costco and Walmart and Sam's and wherever, that's not that's not grown out in the wild type of thing. That is a farmed product. So everything that you're eating is not a real food in the sense that you're talking about, that wheat is also changed over centuries. Not to mention, studies have shown that gluten-free diets can be deficient in fiber, iron, folate, niacin, thiamine, calcium, phosphorus, and zinc. So when people cut out gluten and they start losing weight, they're like, oh my gosh, this works, You're not losing weight because you cut out gluten. You're losing weight because you cut out probably a ton of junk that you were eating, and not to mention you're probably on a low-carb diet now. It's like you go out to eat, and instead of getting a sandwich at Subway, you get a salad. Or instead of eating cookies for dessert, you eat some fruit. What do you think is going to happen? You're probably going to lose weight. You're cutting calories at the end of the day. There is a doctor, and she hates gluten. And this is what she says. Her name is Dr. Marcia Alvarez. And she specializes in nutritional programs for obese patients. And she says that when it comes to nutrition, wheat may be considered as the evil grain. And she says, modern wheat grains could certainly be considered at the root of all evil in the world of nutrition, since there are so many documented health problems across so many populations in the world. She goes on and asserts that wheat is now responsible for more intolerances than almost any other food in the world. She says, in my practice of over 2 decades, we have documented that for every 10 people with digestive problems, obesity, irritable bowel syndrome, diabetes, arthritis, and even heart disease, 8 out of the 10 have a problem with wheat. And once we remove the wheat from their diet, most of their symptoms disappear within 3 to 6 months. So Alvarez is obviously, she hates wheat, right? And a lot of people, like she's saying, will claim that they have, maybe they're not celiac, but they're gluten intolerant, okay? So maybe you go to the doctor and you're like, I really think I'm gluten intolerant. And they're like, well, let's do some tests. Let's do an endoscopy, let's do a blood test, whatever. And it comes back and you're not. And you're just like, well, I know I'm gluten intolerant. And they're like, well, you know what? You're probably just non-celiac. Or you're like, I know I'm celiac. And they're like, well, you probably have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So basically gluten intolerance is what they're calling it. Even though you weren't tested positive for celiac, wheat can still be a big issue for you. So you need to avoid it just as if you did have celiac. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there were studies done by this guy named Peter Gibson, and this was done in 2011. And I'm going to read this because it's very interesting, and it talks about the fact that the whole thing basically behind gluten is psychological. And it says, this is in 2011, and his name is Peter Gibson. He's a professor of gastroenterology at Monash University and the director of the GI unit at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, Australia. So he published a study that found that gluten, which obviously is found in grains like wheat, barley, and rye, would cause gastrointestinal distress in patients without celiac disease. This was a double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled experiment that was one of the strongest pieces of evidence to date for non-celiac gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance. So he does this study, and it comes out, and he's like, the study is basically one of the biggest pieces of evidence to say that gluten intolerance really is a real thing. So he's like, I'm not satisfied with this. Like, I'm not satisfied with the results from my study. And it was really interesting because the study didn't show anything that would actually be causing the subjects to have adverse reactions to gluten. And there were a lot more variables to the control. So he was like, what if somebody's like messing up the results? Like what if there's some other confounding factor? Like what's going on? So he decides to redo the study. And what he did was he gets these 37 people and he provides them with every single meal for the duration of the trial. Any and all potential dietary triggers for gastrointestinal symptoms would be removed, including lactose from milk products, certain preservatives like benzoates, propionates, sulfites, nitrites, and fermentable, poorly absorbed short-chain carbohydrates, also known as FODMAPs. And last but not least, 9 days worth of urine and fecal matter would be collected. So, with this new study, he is like serious, like he's making sure all his I's are dotted, all his T's are crossed, like there's going to be actual controls and variables to really see what is going on with this. So, the 37 subjects take part in this. And at the beginning, they are all confirmed not to have diagnosed celiac disease. But they also are those whose gastrointestinal symptoms improved when they went on a gluten-free diet. So they are fulfilling the criteria of having non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Like, these people just ate whatever they wanted to, and then they had really bad issues or whatever because they were eating gluten. And then when they cut out gluten, all of a sudden, they felt better. So they would meet the criteria of having non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So they were first fed a diet low in FODMAPs for 2 weeks. This was called the baseline diet. And then they were given one of 3 diets for a week with either 16 grams per day of added gluten, which was high gluten, 2 grams of gluten, and 14 grams of whey protein isolate, which was low gluten, or 16 grams of whey protein isolate, which was the placebo. So each subject shuffled through every single diet so that they could serve as their own controls, and no one ever knew what diet they were on at the time. After the main experiment, a second one was conducted to ensure that the whey protein isolate placebo was suitable. So in this one, 22 of the original subjects went through the 3 different diets, which was 16 grams of added gluten, 16 grams of added whey, or the baseline diet for 3 days each. Now, when Gibson analyzes the data, he finds that each treatment diet, whether it included gluten or not, prompted subjects to reporting a worsening of gastrointestinal symptoms to similar degrees. They reported pain, bloating, nausea, gas, and all increased over the baseline low FODMAP diet. Even in the second experiment, when the placebo diet was identical to the baseline diet, subjects reported a worsening of symptoms. So the data clearly indicated a nocebo effect. Basically, this is the same reaction that gets people sick from wind turbines or wireless internet. Patients reported gastrointestinal distress without any apparent physical cause. Gluten was not the culprit. The cause was likely psychological. Participants expected the diets to make them sick, so they did. And this led to Gibson's final conclusion in his 2011 research, which says, in contrast to our first study, we could find absolutely no specific response to gluten. So, instead, they reported that FODMAPs were far more likely cause of the gastrointestinal problems attributed to gluten intolerance. So, FODMAPs, if you don't know what that is, a lot of people will go on a low FODMAP diet. FODMAP would include fructose, so honey, fruits, high fructose corn syrup, etc., lactose from dairy, fructans from wheat, garlic, onion, inulin, etc., galactans that come from legumes like beans, lentils, soybeans, etc., and then polluls, which are sweeteners that come from isomalt, mannitol, sorbitol, xylitol, and then stone fruits like avocado, apricot, cherries, nectarines, peaches, plums, etc. So the way that FODMAPs works is it's an osmotic type of thing. It pulls water into your intestinal tract. So the food might not be very well digested or even well absorbed. It ends up getting fermented by the bacteria in your gut, which can leave you like bloated, nauseous, like whatever. So a lot of symptoms of this are diarrhea, constipation, gas, bloating, cramping, blah, 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 blah. So a lot of people will deal with these type of things when you eat these type of food, but when you go to a low FODMAPs diet, a lot of these symptoms are reduced. So I do want to make a note on this too. The low FODMAPs thing can be psychological as well. You have to be really careful, but too, this does help a lot of people. If you're someone who just like, you cannot eat raw garlic, you cannot eat raw onions, you cannot eat certain fruits, you cannot eat like, I don't know, specifically like xylitol, sorbitol, that kind of thing. Like when you chew gum, you just like get so bloated. Like that's how I was. Maybe try eating low FODMAPs. But again, if you go nuts with this, it's kind of like totally contradicting this whole video. Because the whole point is a lot of this stuff is psychological, okay? So I'm going to keep reading from this study. So Jessica Berzirski, she's a gastroenterologist. She worked alongside Gibson during this, and she noted that when participants consumed the baseline low FODMAP diet, almost all of their symptoms improved. So it says reduction of FODMAPs in their diet uniformly reduced gastrointestinal symptoms and fatigue in the run-in period, after which they were minimally symptomatic. It goes on, it says, on current evidence, the existence of the entity of non-celiac gluten sensitivity remains unsubstantiated. Consider this: no underlying cause for gluten intolerance has yet been discovered. Moreover, there are a host of triggers for gastrointestinal distress, many of which are not controlled in previous studies. Generally, non-celiac gluten sensitivity is assumed to be the culprit when celiac disease is ruled out. But that is the trap, Berzirski says. One which would potentially lead to confirmation bias, thus blinding researchers, doctors, and patients to other possibilities. So if you go and you say, I know I have celiac disease, and your doctor's like, well, let's do a test, and you end up not having celiac, then they're like, oh, you probably have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, so you just need to stay away from gluten. And it's like, that's not going to fix your problems, because gluten's probably not the problem. The problem is probably something else. Either it's in your head, or maybe you need to cut back on the FODMAP type of food, specifically really raw, high fiber foods that are really difficult to digest for a lot of people. So it goes on, it says, Berzirski recognizes that gluten may very well be a stomach irritant that we're looking for. But there's definitely something going on, she said. But true non-celiac gluten sensitivity may only affect a very small number of people and may affect more extraintestinal symptoms than first thought. This will only be confirmed with an understanding of its mechanism. So then it goes on, it says, she's currently focused on maintaining an open mind and redefining her experimental methods to determine whether or not non-celiac gluten sensitivity truly exists. Then she says, we need to make sure that this research is as well controlled as possible and is reproducible. And then she adds in, much, much more research is needed. So you can tell that she's kind of like not wanting to give up this idea that gluten sensitivity doesn't exist. But again, she says, we need a lot more research in this area, which is so interesting. And basically, from this study, in a nutshell, it was all psychological. I have been down this road myself. And I've worked with people too who literally send me emails and say they can only eat like 5 foods because they're afraid of a certain food making them sick. And it's all, I'm not going to say it's all in your head, but the majority of it is in your head. Specifically, if you have restrictive tendencies, you've overexercised, a combination of the two, whatever. Like, if you were just a normal everyday person with no issues with diets, calories, carbs, counting stuff, weighing stuff, running like crazy, like all of that, and you started having some serious issues, that is a concern. But if you're someone who has come from a restrictive past, whether it's low calorie, low carb, whatever, you've used laxative colonics, you've overexercised, whatever, you might as well just get ready. You're going to have some digestive issues. And going and blaming that on gluten and like cutting out gluten products from your diet is only going to make things worse, like much, 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 much worse. Because then you're not eating bread, and then you're scared of bread, and then you're scared of muffins, and you're scared of like on and on and on, and it's going to further your disorder. So I want to share this story about this. I heard this on some podcast. I cannot remember where I heard this, but basically there was this guy, and I've shared this before, but it's so telling. But there's this guy, and he's been to tons and tons of doctors trying to figure out what's going on with him. He had digestive issues. He was just like wasting away. Like he was just awful. And he had gotten to the point to where all he could eat was like broccoli, brown rice, and like steamed chicken, basically. And so he would just go back to these doctors, and they're like, dude, we cannot figure out what's going on with you. Like, I don't know why every time you eat something you get bloated, or why this happens, or why you feel bad, whatever. And he literally got to the point just die, basically. He was just like, whatever. So he leaves, and they don't see him for like 6 months. And he comes back, and he walks in the door, and the doctors don't even recognize him at first. And he checks in, and he's like, yeah, my name's like Bob or whatever. And they're like, what happened to you? Like, you look awesome. Like, he had gained like 50 pounds. He had like, his face looked like very bright. He had a lot of vigor and like energy about him and stuff. And he was basically just like, they were like, what diet have you been on? Like, what have you been doing? What supplements are you taking? And like, what doctor did you go see to turn your life around and all this? And he was like, honestly, guys, like, I've been on the pizza and beer diet. Like, that's what I've done. And they're like, what are you talking about? And he said, I got to the point to where I literally could not eat a lot of foods. Like, I wouldn't allow myself to eat them. I thought every time I'd eat them, I'd get sick. And I got to this point to where I thought, this is no way to live. Like, if I'm going to die, I'm at least going to die enjoying it or whatever. So he's like, I just decided to start eating pizza every night and drinking beer every night. And that's what I did, And he was like, and I feel 1,000 times better. I have my life back. Like, I can eat whatever I want to now. Like, I faced the fear of the unknown. Literally thought he had all these like issues with him and everything. And he just needed to live his life and get over it, basically. And honestly, the same thing happened to me. Like, I got to a point years ago when I literally could not eat but like a handful of foods because anything that I ate was going to make me sick. And I had built it up in my mind so much that I thought, oh my gosh, like, I have candida, I have, I'm gluten intolerant, I'm dairy intolerant, I'm this intolerant, like, I can't have this. And it was just like, what am I going to even eat? And finally, one day I was just like, forget it, like, especially when I heard that pizza and beer thing, I was like, I'm just going to eat whatever I want. And I did, and nothing happened. And there's a huge correlation between your mind and your gut and the whole placebo effect. And I'm going to do a video really in depth on that here coming up soon. But you have to just let go of control. And, I'm not saying, like, if you do have legit diagnosed celiac, that is a serious condition. I'm not downplaying that at all. I'm talking more specifically to the people who think it's really cool to be gluten intolerant or just want to do it for whatever reason. Like, don't do it. You just need to eat. Number one, it's going to cause issues with food. And number two, bread and wheat and everything is so good. Like, why would you not want to have it? If you could, like, who cares? And even still, people who have certain allergies or intolerances or whatever are still overcoming them today. Like, I know a ton of people who legit had issues with certain foods, and now they can eat those foods fine, So your body is changing and everything. And so even if you do have issues like with certain foods, don't just throw in the towel and say, I can never, ever, 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 ever have that food again, specifically if you have restrictive tendencies, because you're just creating more rules and more stuff for yourself. I have been there. Like, I know what it feels like to think that you have all of these issues going on, when at the end of the day, all you really need to do is just eat and live your life. I'm not saying like none of this stuff exists and it's all in your head, but I am saying if you're the type of person that there's always something wrong with you, like, and you always think that you're the one out of a billion that has some type of crazy issue, you need to really reevaluate your situation. And at the end of the day, a lot of it probably is in your head. Do not think that you are the one person on the planet that has every single disease known to man. Like, the chances of that are highly, highly, highly unlikely. So give yourself a break, you know, just eat what you want to eat, do what you want to do, like, quit putting all these rules on yourself and just enjoy your life, you know. And I guarantee you, the minute that you let up and you de-stress and you take a breath and you say, I'm going to go eat some pizza, or I'm going to eat some bread or whatever, like, you know, I posted something on Instagram the other day about a girl who wrote and said she finally allowed herself to eat chips after 7 years. And she cried because she was so happy. Like, guys, that's what it's about. It's serious. Like, this is a real deal. Don't let it overcome your life. So, go eat some bread. Don't worry about it. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time.